local saying that out of the world into Stigursey and out of Stigursey into the sea. It was to some extent off limits.
The site itself is over 170 hectares, so put it in perspective, that's about 160 football pitches. Obviously, the power station footprint's only a small part of that, but in building such a complex piece of infrastructure, you need a lot of lay-down areas, a lot of areas where you can house your contractors, and also where you can pre-construct some of the major components for the power plant. We're very clear that we're shaping the future of the use of this land, building a power plant that produces 6% of the UK's electricity, but we're also, I'm personally very interested in and fascinated by how this land was used in the past, and it's really important that we capture that heritage so that we understand it for future generations.
It's fascinating. It's the first chance we've really had to look at a whole landscape as opposed to a site on its own in the middle of nowhere. So we begin to understand how the landscape changed through time.
We knew that there'd been a 1993 excavation take place in this area, just trial trenching, and that it showed that there was a Roman settlement, actually pretty much where we are right now. We also knew that there's a scheduled monument just outside of the site boundary. That's a late Neolithic, early Bronze Age round barrow called Pixie's Mound or Wick's Barrow. And we know sort of the historic background of the villages and the hamlets in the area. So a few miles to the southeast is Cummage, and we know there's a Roman settlement there and it was a Roman port. So that all indicates that there's the potential for earlier and additional settlements in this area.
Starting at Lilstock, there's a farm there which is let to someone, and then the next one, Culver Street, and then Knighton Farm, which the Knox family have been farming since, I think it would be the 1940s, when Clive's father took on the tenancy from my uncle. And at that stage, he would have had quite a big area here and going down towards Knighton Farm. And then Clive himself began to take on more land, but the Knox family have been here since the 1940s.
I was born January 1944, and so I've known this all my life, with a couple of years overseas in between to do other work. I've been on the farm all my life. I didn't want to slog away the same as my parents and grandparents had. I wanted modern mechanised farming, which involved removing some of the hedges, filling in some of the ponds, embracing modern techniques and increasing output.
Well, what is interesting about a landscape is it's living, it's always changing. Now the buried archaeology may have been Bronze Age and Iron Age and Roman, but of course there is archaeology occurring all around us. There were 3 barns, historic barns on the site, and part of the project will be an oral history project. We're very interested in finding out historical memories from people who live in this landscape.
My name is Christine Mary Wills. I was born the 31st of January 1921, and I spent my childhood at Benhall. I was there for 7 years. Dad farmed there, and he was there for 16 years. It was a very, very special place, and we loved Benhall. It was a mile or more from the road. I think there was 4 bedrooms. We didn't have any carpet on the floors. We were never short of food at all. And my mum used to make her own bread because there was a range there. Well, we kept animals, a lot of cattle. We had lots of sheep, and sometimes they'd fall out over the cliff because they'd go too near to the cliff eating, and they'd fall out over, and of course they'd be dead by the time they'd reach the ground. We kept loads of chicken and geese and turkeys and all that sort of thing, and I couldn't have had a better childhood. I wouldn't want to change my childhood at all, because I had a wonderful time. I don't think it was more than about 2 years after we left that it was burnt down, and we took Mum back there to see it. It upset her quite a bit. You know, it was really a long-term home for them.
Part of being a farmer is actually walking rather than driving the tractor to see what weeds are growing or what diseases or insects are plaguing your crops, which involves focusing at ground level. So you tend to see anything that looks out of place, be it a worked flint, a pottery shard, or a bit of scrap metal. And those, if they're of any interest, get dropped into the pocket and probably are only found when the trousers go into the washing machine.
It is an amazing collection, because just having a quick look at it now, we've got many thousands of years of history preserved in these trays. It is remarkable.
Yes.
Which bits is there anything you particularly, find as your favourite, or particular questions on?
Well, I'm very fond of the worked flints, and I just like to imagine, what they were used for. Like, I believe that would probably be an arrowhead.
Oh wow, that is remarkably good, actually.
And there's a number of little chips from it.
Yeah, it's a barbed and tanged. That's one half of it. The other half's broken off. But these may well be back into Neolithic, Mesolithic, even some of these early flints. The other bits of pottery, the first again that jumps out to me is all this Roman stuff. So clearly a big Roman site nearby. This is sort of 2nd, 3rd century, and there's some earlier 1st century. And is that a piece of Samian there? Yeah, I think it probably is. You see that little red piece with the red glaze? That's Samian, which again can be 1st, 2nd century. So that's early Roman. And then you've got a whole scatter through. That could be, I think that's medieval. Other pieces that jump out to me, this is rather fine little pieces of late medieval or middle medieval, shall we say. The base of, and that glaze on that piece is particularly good. And these are the bottom of a vessel for holding beer, wine, cider I expect round here as much as anything else. And that's the little spout where it comes out at the bottom, so more of those. So, as I say, literally nearly 6,000 years of history in these trays, all found from your walkings over the landscape. Basically on this side of the valley we've cleared a huge piece of landscape away. The archaeologists are now carrying out extensive dig, because basically after the geophysical survey, the trial trenching has shown us there's something here. We're now down to the subsoil, and what we're seeing are cut features. Really it's the difference between light brown and dark brown soils, and the archaeologists can then differentiate the edges between the natural reddish soil and then the backfilled ditches, which are full of darker deposits. So what the archaeologists do then is to cut sections and samples through those ditches to provide us with the dating evidence that is hopefully sealed away in those soil deposits. We can also take evidence of organic remains. We can take soil samples and go and sieve and look for seeds and snail shells to get an idea of what the environment was like in which the people were living who were in and around this part of the valley, shall we say, 2,000 plus years ago. In this landscape, basically we've got a stream behind us and we've got a gentle sloping hill, and because of that gentle slope, much of the archaeology here is buried under where the soil has moved down the slope. It's called colluvium, but it seals the features. What we're looking at, where the area has been stripped by machine, the archaeologists are now getting in there, doing sample sections through dark soil features. Often they represent filled-in ditches, pits, or sometimes even small post holes that could be associated with buildings.
Just finished machining this area in the southeast of the site. We uncovered a large north-south ditch just to the west of an earlier ditch. Within the top fills of this ditch, we seem to have a midden deposit, which is the household waste, probably from a nearby settlement. Within this midden itself, we're finding limpet shells, as well as some cattle bone. Just within the top of this feature, we're seeing Iron Age pottery, good quality pottery as well.
It looks like the site is split into 3 separate areas. Over the far side we have a roundhouse with some internal features, so it looks like it's cob built as a foundation trench, then with some internal pits to support the roof. That's enclosed within an enclosure, and then you come into the central piece, which is a number of enclosure ditches that look like it's pastoral land for farming, potentially sheep moving on to cows where the enclosures get bigger. And then you've got the third enclosure, which looks like it's containing some sort of grain production. There's lots of burnt spelt grains there and lots of little burnt pits that they contain that's within them. We didn't quite expect to have this level of archaeology. We were expecting a few Roman ditches, but in fact we've ended up with an Iron Age settlement.
Really, the excavation is just the very beginning of a scientific experiment project in many ways. The data gathering itself is just to get the evidence together, and the reason it takes long to record is because if you don't record it properly, you can never go back to re-investigate. So it's a one-off opportunity. Once all the records have been made, all the finds have been processed and analysed, basically the data is collated and put together into its contextual relationships, so that we understand where things come from on site and how they got there. From that's how you form your site interpretation. So you know when the site started, what happened to it, when it ended, and what happened when it went out of use.
One of the things we are going to be able to tell is the story of the whole landscape, because we're interested in the field boundaries. We're interested in the late medieval, 19th through to the 20th century farming practices. The barns that have now been removed have their own story to tell, and we understand a little bit more now about how they fitted in, which part of the farms they were connected with, and how the arable and pasture systems worked around them in the 19th through into the 20th century. So from all of this evidence, research, we will have a complete picture of a little snapshot of one part of the history of the whole landscape focused around this Hinkley Point project.
Well, this is a fairly typical barn of the area in its unimproved state. It's had very little done to it over the years. Again, opposing doors, north and south walls, 2 high-level windows for pitching the sheaves in. On the south side, there's a lean-to lean-to roof where the cattle used to lie under. It had mangers and hay racks, and associated with it is the other small shed, which I believe is a later addition, There was also cattle lying in area.
How many stock would you fit in there then?
About 30. Memories coming down here at weekends with my father, and he would try to keep control of the two or three unruly kids and try and put us to work putting hay and straw out for the cattle. I used to hate it. Sunday morning was work hard with the cattle until it was time to go to church, and then we had to go to church.
Well, you can see the building now with half of the roof's gone and the simple sort of A-frame truss, but they look like Bridgewater tiles on the top, but might originally have even been thatched. We're at the back of the barn, the rear side here, which is south-facing, so it would have been a little bit warmer than where we were on the north side.
Ideal for a stock. Cattle like to lie down and chew the cud in the sunshine and out of the wind, and this fitted the bill exactly.
Archaeology is always surprising. Every time you think you have a story, you find something which contradicts that story. But in this case, every week has been a surprise, because we've got a site with layers, and every time we think we've dealt with the site, we take another layer off and find another archaeological site underneath it.
I'm looking for little fragments of Bronze Age pottery which look a lot like mud. But they're quite rare, so we've sampled the whole thing. We've got all of the soil from the whole midden, brought it in buckets, and I have to sift through it to make sure we've got it all out. And also bits of snail shell, limpet shell, and animal bone. Basically, we're finding.
This is a nice little Roman brooch of about 1st to 2nd century AD. We've got coins. Unfortunately, the coins haven't survived too well. But this one is probably 4th century. A bit of a clean, professionally might give us a bit more detail to date that a little bit better. Do you get things like this sort of flint-tanged arrowhead, which generally you can only say is sort of a late Neolithic or early Bronze Age? Things like this, they're a little bit out of the ordinary. And I don't know, they appeal to me. It's such a large vessel, obviously handmade. In this case, under the rim, you can see where someone's just rolled their thumbs to give a pattern under the side. And that, to me, I think you get wares that are mass-produced, but things like that really sort of, I think, take you and put you in touch with the potter who made it.
One of the great challenges from archaeological excavation is to then interpret that information. And one of the best ways that we have adopted is to do reconstruction drawings. For that, we've used Victor Ambrose, the well-known artist who's worked on the Time team, done a lot of work for us in the museum in Taunton. And his interpretation, his analysis, and indeed his expertise is used to help us paint that picture of what life may have been like in the Iron Age, in the Bronze Age, or even in the Roman period.
Certainly the information I'm getting back from our pottery specialist who's producing spot dates, so they're snapshots based on a few sherds from each context, is very much that we're in the later prehistoric period into the early Roman in the sites 4 and 5. So we are essentially talking the Iron Age. We have a few sherds of Bronze Age pottery, and I think we essentially have a couple of Bronze Age field boundaries underlying the Iron Age settlement and other activity, and that's then moving into the early Roman period.
I think we're looking at the sort of everyday story of an everyday country folk here. We're looking at a village life. In the Iron Age, it's particularly interesting because we think the village is actually next to a river that you can get out to the sea on. So we're looking at a very odd sort of semi-port type village.
The weather has been very challenging throughout this site. This has proved very difficult. It's health and safety, it's trying to excavate when everything is covered in mud. We've had flooding down at the bottom of the hill slope, pumping issues. It has just caused problems and it's been a bit of a nightmare, really.
Just had a huge build-up of water with all the record rainfall we've had. Really has made life rather tough. That we've had lots of ponding up on the site, which obviously we've had to pump away, and then the simple logistics of moving around safely and equally not wanting to walk on areas, so we destroy the archaeology and so forth. Yeah.
Occasionally, while you're excavating, you find things that take you back to a moment in the past. We have a hobnail shoe just over in the top of one of the ditches over there, and that may well be the first signs that we have a Roman burial, somebody buried with their shoes, with their sandals, with their boots. And what you're seeing there is a moment in the past where somebody was buried, and you're seeing that moment where a family from this valley, from this muddy field, were saying goodbye to somebody. And that is just, sorry, it's phenomenally moving. It gets me every time.
I remember the site before there were any power stations here. A lot of the land was, at that stage, was semi-derelict, and the owner was neglecting it, and our cattle quite often would break out and would be lost in a jungle. And so it was one of my jobs was to go searching for cattle to round them up to bring them back. We were told that the electricity would be too cheap to meter. That was one of the lines that was fed to the local people. They thought this was wonderful. We're going to get almost free electricity. Well, that's a bit of a pipe dream, isn't it? And as kids, we used to range right through the site. I've been inside the pressure vessel before it was welded up, and we could go anywhere. We were never challenged. They didn't have security and they didn't have health and safety.
It was in 1957 that work began here in this flat Somerset countryside, and tall skeletons of steel began to change the skyline. Well, now those skeletons have been closed, and Hinkley Point is very much a place of concrete and glass, like some huge industrial factory which has strayed into the countryside.
When we bear in mind that Hinkley Point Nuclear Power Station is the largest construction infrastructure project in Europe, it obviously unprecedented opportunities to actually have a look at a large-scale landscape. In this case, we're in an area where little was known about the archaeology because there's no development in West Somerset. But what we've shown with this project is actually this landscape in the past was just as populous as anywhere else in the county.
It wasn't exceptional. I mean, I think what we saw was perhaps a picture of the past that maybe you might have expected of prehistoric remains, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, a kind of slice of landscape that perhaps was not untypical of Somerset. But what it did give us as a chance to do was just to look and begin to understand the basics of this landscape, and there was always potential for unexpected remains to turn up.
As far as we were concerned 2 years ago, we were all finished on site and all the archaeology was dealt with. So it was just by sheer stroke of luck that Kia Bam put their haul road right through the centre of this cemetery site.
Well, we had this discovery of human remains. And human remains don't tend to show very well on geophysical survey or aerial photographs. So these were totally unexpected. And it could have been 1 or 2 burials, but as it's transpired, as we've exposed the area, we now have over 100 burials. And what's really fascinating is that they actually fill in one of the poorest periods for the archaeology of Britain. That is the enigmatic shadowy period between the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages. So to find actually a post-Roman cemetery dating probably to the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries AD is a discovery of national importance and will be a site that will figure in the textbooks of Dark Age Britain for generations to come.
This is essentially a plan of the site as it stands. So you can see here, this is our original excavation from 2 years ago. This is SPE1, and this is where we are now. We've got all the graves sort of centrally around this large spread, and this here is our sort of ritual feasting area. So this is the curved ditch, and this is the area of burning with a few post holes underneath. Within the ditch there wasn't a massive amount found. We had a copper ring, a iron stylus, and towards the western end there was a piece of B1 amphora.
To many people it looks like a piece of plant pot, but in fact this is one of the most exciting pieces of pottery we've found at Hinkley Point, because it's characteristic with this ridge decoration, bright red fabric, and it comes all the way from the Aegean. It's all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean.
What's fascinating about this pottery is that it turns up in the parts of Britain that actually were perhaps the least Romanised, that had the least contact with what we would call the Roman Empire. So it turns up a lot in Cornwall, in Wales, Western Scotland and Ireland, and just a smattering up the Somerset coast. So what is going on here? Because where it doesn't turn up is in the former Roman towns, places like Exeter and Ilchester. So it must relate to these post-Roman kingdoms somehow getting involved in an active process of trade, but completely separate from the whole mechanisms of the Roman Empire that had gone before. So it just shines a light on an incredibly dark, ill-known period, and just points to the fact that these people, who are almost hard to find archaeologically, and yet they were linking still with the world of the Mediterranean.
Here is one of the typical multiple graves that we have. As you can see, there's an adult male here, adult female here, and a small child. This grave is then cutting an earlier grave that you can just see the top of there, which looks like sort of juvenile, so youngish child. The adult males seem to be older than the adult females as their bones are fused, whereas the adult females aren't. And the children that we're getting are generally by the feet, either in between the two or just to one side, as you can see here. We did have a couple more multiples. There was another 3 here where the child was in between. Again, the adult male was this side, the adult female was that side, and then the child in between the two. And we had 4 adult males in this one. As you can see, it's quite a large grave. You had the 2 males laid out quite nicely, and then another 2 sort of squashed in around that edge. This, unfortunately, was the better preserved area. As we've been looking round, they've been getting more and more fragmentary. So again, here we have multiples. You can see an adult, a possible juvenile here, and then there's another set here. You can see large bits are missing, possibly where a plough has come through. So they're quite fragmentary. They're a lot softer because they're a lot shallower. We're lucky to really get anything because the coverage over the top of this was only about 20 centimetres. As you can see here, we've got a slate coffin. Unfortunately, again, this is really fragmentary. We've lost a lot of the sides, and it looks like we may have lost another skeleton because this one seems to be concentrated over to one side, so it is possibly likely that there was another one here.
All the remains have to come out of the ground because this is going to be a building site. And you have to show respect because these are the physical remains of individuals like you and me who have died in the past. They're not just a collection of bones, they are the remains of individuals. And we need to respect that, we need to lift them carefully, with a degree of reverence to be frank, and make sure they're properly treated afterwards. And that's why every trace of human remains needs to come out of this site before the construction work continues. I mean, what this site provides is an insight into a period in Western Britain after the end of the Roman period, but before the Anglo-Saxons came. So this has got nothing to do with the Anglo-Saxons. This is the Britons, this is the indigenous Britons adopting a way of life at a period when further east Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were developing. So it does provide a window or an insight into a unique culture, the Western British culture, before the advent of Anglo-Saxon and the birth of England.
That's what I personally find fascinating about archaeology. It's not just the features, it's the interplay between mankind and the environment. That's what people live in and utilise every day for food and so forth. So it is very much how that's played out over the millennia and how people move across the landscape. That in some periods this area was favoured, in others it's not. Now, is that climate change or is it some other cultural view? And that's what really fascinates me.
I've lived with this project since 2009 and I'm really pleased to say I think it's been an immaculate project. I think it's been carried out by Cotswold and AMEC and EDF in a way which means we've got the best out of the archaeological information.
Projects the size and scale of Hinkley Point don't come along very often, but when they do, as archaeologists, we have the chance to look at that whole landscape. And we've managed to look at everything from field patterns right the way through to the 19th century and then way back into understanding the prehistoric landscape. So it's really looking at a big chunk of Somerset on the landscape scale that makes this an extremely important project.